Before you press play, understand this clearly. This is not a story about kings, battles, or dates to memorize. This is the story of how the modern world was quietly built, how power moved from swords to ideas, how art, science, money, and information slowly replaced faith, bloodlines, and tradition. The Renaissance was not just paintings and sculptures. It was the moment human beings started asking dangerous questions. Who decides truth? Who controls knowledge? And why some voices matter more than others? If you listen carefully, you will see how printing destroyed old authorities, why science was a threat long before it became progress, and how ordinary people slowly became citizens instead of subjects. This story is not fast. It does not shout for attention. It moves slowly, layer by layer, just like history itself. You can listen to this story to learn, or you can listen to it at night before sleep and let the idea settle quietly in your mind. Because this is not entertainment designed to excite you. It is understanding designed to stay with you. If you want to know why the world works the way it does today, this story is for you. Close your eyes and let the present day fade into a soft, distant hum. We're traveling back across the centuries, leaving behind the glow of digital screens and the rush of modern life. Imagine the air cooling and thinning as we settle into the rolling hills of Tuscany in the mid-14th century. The world is transitioning. The heavy, protective walls of the Middle Ages are beginning to feel less like a fortress and more like a shell that the human spirit is ready to outgrow. The awakening of the Italian city-states. Italy at this time is not a single nation, but a vibrant patchwork of independent city-states. Florence, Venice, Milan, and Siena. Each is a jewel box of ambition. Unlike the feudal lands of Northern Europe, these cities are bustling hubs of trade and intellect. Picture the city of Florence. It is the new Athens. The scent of the city is a mix of cured leather from the tanners, expensive dyes from the wool merchants, and the earthy aroma of stone dust as new palazzos rise toward the sky. The gold florin has become the currency of Europe, and with this wealth comes a newfound sense of possibility. The socio-political landscape is shifting. The rigid hierarchy of the church and the nobility is being challenged by a rising merchant class, the popolo grasso, or fat people. These families, like the burgeoning Medici, realize that power is no longer just about the sword. It is about prestige, beauty, and the patronage of the mind. The shadow and the light. This rebirth, the Rinascita, did not begin in a time of easy peace, but rather in the wake of great sorrow. The Black Death of 1348 had swept through these streets, thinning the population and leaving the survivors with a profound realization. Life is fragile, and the now is worth celebrating. As the trauma of the plague receded, it left behind a vacuum that was filled with a thirst for life. Scholars began to look backward to move forward. They rediscovered the lost manuscripts of ancient Greece and Rome, hidden away in monastery libraries or brought over by scholars fleeing the fall of Constantinople. The birth of humanism. In the quiet studies of men like Petrarch, a new philosophy began to breathe. Humanism. Imagine a scholar sitting by candlelight, his fingers tracing the vellum of a recovered text by Cicero or Virgil. In the Middle Ages, the focus was almost entirely on the divine and the afterlife, but the humanists began to argue that man was a noble animal capable of reason, beauty, and civic virtue. They didn't turn their backs on God. Rather, they believed that by perfecting the human form and the human mind, they were honoring the Creator. The atmosphere in Florence is electric with this idea. The narrow cobblestone streets are filled with the sounds of debate in the piazzas. There is a sense that the Dark Ages are ending and the Golden Age is dawning. The light is changing, from the flickering candle of the monk's cell to the bright, clear sun of the Mediterranean morning. Part 2. The Mechanics of Influence. Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo. While the Renaissance is often framed as a period of pure artistic inspiration, it was, in reality, a high-stakes competition for survival and relevance. We look at two men who occupied this space, Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo Buonarroti. Leonardo da Vinci, the iterative strategist. Leonardo's career was not a steady climb, but a series of unfinished projects and calculated pivots. Unlike the myth of the solitary dreamer, Leonardo functioned much like a high-level consultant. He understood that in the 15th century, an artist was a craftsman whose existence depended entirely on the patronage of men like Ludovico Sforza of Milan. The Sforza horse. One of Leonardo's greatest failures and a turning point was his attempt to cast a massive bronze horse for Ludovico. He spent years calculating the physics and logistics, but when war with France loomed, the 75 tons of bronze intended for the statue were diverted to make cannons. The project was scrapped. This illustrates a cold reality. Art was always secondary to the military and political needs of the state. The Last Supper, 1495 to 1498. This was an experiment in chemistry that backfired. Leonardo hated the speed required for traditional buon fresco, painting on wet plaster. He wanted to linger and iterate. He invented a new technique using oil and tempera on dry plaster. Within years, the moisture of the refectory walls caused the paint to flake. The masterpiece began to disintegrate in his own lifetime. Its significance today is not in its preservation, but in its mathematical perspective. Leonardo used a nail and string to create a vanishing point that aligned perfectly with the viewer's eye level, a psychological trick that forced the audience into the scene. Michelangelo, the political instrument. Michelangelo was a different creature, intense, litigious, and deeply enmeshed in the power struggles of the papacy. His work on the Sistine Chapel ceiling, 1508 to 1512, was not a job he wanted. He considered himself a sculptor and suspected his rivals, Bramante and Raphael, had tricked Pope Julius II into assigning him the ceiling to ensure his failure. The physical toll. To understand the human impact, we must look at the physical reality. Michelangelo did not paint lying on his back. He designed a complex scaffolding system that allowed him to stand, neck craned back, for 4 years. The paint dripped into his eyes. He developed chronic back pain and skin infections. The conflict of the Sistine. The ceiling was a political statement. Julius II was a warrior pope looking to assert the absolute authority of the church. Michelangelo's decision to paint the human form with exaggerated muscular tension, often called terribilidad, reflected the turbulent energy of a church under pressure. The turning point. 1504, Florence. There is a specific moment where these two paths crossed: the commission for the Great Council Hall in Florence. Both men were hired to paint massive battle scenes on opposite walls. It was a staged competition intended to boost the city's morale after political upheaval. Neither finished. Leonardo's experimental oil paints failed to dry and ran down the wall. Michelangelo was called away by the Pope to work on a tomb. This moment marks a shift from the artist as a guild worker to the artist as a celebrity whose time was fought over by the most powerful men in Europe. The consequence was a change in how society valued labor, shifting from the value of the materials used, gold and lapis lazuli, to the value of the individual's intellectual property. Part 3. The Structural Shift. Knowledge, Power, and the Printing Press. We move now from the elite studios of Florence to the wider European landscape. The Renaissance was not merely a change in aesthetic taste, it was a fundamental reorganization of how information was stored, verified, and distributed. This section examines the mechanics of that change and the consequences for the average person. The turning point. The Gutenberg Press, circa 1440. The most significant technological disruption of the era did not come from a painter's brush, but from a goldsmith in Mainz, Germany. Johannes Gutenberg did not invent the idea of printing, but he combined several existing technologies, the olive press, oil-based inks, and movable metal type into a viable industrial process. The fact of the matter? Before the press, a handwritten Bible took roughly a year to produce and cost as much as a small farm. By 1500, printing shops had spread to over 200 cities across Europe. The consequence? This led to the information paradox. While it allowed for the preservation of classical texts, it also allowed for the rapid spread of misinformation, propaganda, and radical dissent. The church lost its monopoly on the written word. For the first time, a merchant or a literate artisan could own a book and interpret law or scripture without a mediator. This was the birth of the modern public sphere. Humanism as a practical tool. We often speak of humanism as an abstract philosophy, but in the 15th and 16th centuries, it was a curriculum. Scholars like Erasmus of Rotterdam applied the humanist method, close reading and linguistic analysis, to the most powerful document in Europe, the New Testament. The internal contradiction. Erasmus was a devout Catholic, yet his work undermined the Church's authority. By comparing original Greek manuscripts to the Latin Vulgate used by the Church for 1,000 years, he found translation errors. The impact? One famous example was the word for penance. The Latin text suggested a physical act, doing penance, while the Greek original suggested a mental change, repentance. This linguistic nuance provided the intellectual ammunition for the Protestant Reformation. It shows how a scholar's desk can be more dangerous than a battlefield. Science, the anatomy of observation. The shift in science was driven by a move away from authority, what Aristotle said, toward empiricism, what I can see. Andreas Vesalius provides a clear case study. In 1543, he published De Humani Corporis Fabrica, on the fabric of the human body. Before Vesalius, medical students learned anatomy by watching a butcher dissect the body while a professor read from an ancient text by Galen. The professor rarely looked at the body, the text was the truth. The decision. Vesalius insisted on doing the dissections himself. He proved Galen, who had based much of his work on monkeys and pigs, wrong on over 200 counts, including the structure of the human heart and jaw. The human impact. This wasn't just academic, it fundamentally changed surgery and the treatment of wounds. However, it also created a gruesome body-snatching economy, as demand for cadavers for study outstripped legal supplies. The advancement of man literally required the violation of the dead. The ordinary life, the price of progress. For the average person, the weaver in Flanders or the farmer in the Romagna, the Renaissance meant a more complex world. Economic anxiety. As trade expanded, so did inflation. The influx of silver from the New World, a direct result of Renaissance-era navigation, devalued currency, making life harder for those on fixed incomes. Literacy and expectation. Literacy began to trickle down. A person who could read was a person who could be taxed more efficiently, but also a person who could participate in political riots. The loss of certainty. The medieval world was small and ordered. The Renaissance world was vast, round, as proven by Magellan's voyage, and increasingly chaotic. The comfort of knowing your place was replaced by the anxiety of making your way. The bureaucratization of the Renaissance state. While artists were perfecting linear perspective, rulers were attempting to apply a similar grid to their populations. This was the era where the state began to separate from the person of the king. The individual, Philip II of Spain. Philip is often portrayed as a religious fanatic. In reality, he was Europe's first true paper king. From his cell-like office in the Escorial, he attempted to govern a global empire through a massive influx of reports, letters, and ledgers. The decision. Philip's insistence on reviewing every document himself created a lethal bottleneck in decision-making. His refusal to delegate, driven by a deep distrust of the nobility, meant that orders for the Netherlands or the Americas often arrived months too late to be relevant. The consequence. This created a culture of "I obey, but I do not fulfill," obedezco pero no cumplo, among his administrators. It was the birth of a cynical, inefficient bureaucracy that would eventually drain the wealth of the Spanish Golden Age. The turning point. The Peace of Augsburg, 1555. This was a moment of profound internal contradiction within the Holy Roman Empire. After decades of religious war following Luther's descent, the elites realized that total victory for either side was mathematically impossible without destroying the economic base of the empire. The mechanism. Cuyos regio, ellos religio. Whose realm, his religion. The treaty allowed local princes to choose between Catholicism and Lutheranism. It was a pragmatic, cold-blooded fix that ignored the actual beliefs of the subjects. The missed alternative. The treaty pointedly excluded Calvinists and other radical groups. By choosing a binary solution to a pluralistic problem, the signatories did not end the conflict. They merely froze it. Long-term impact. This freeze created 40 years of simmering tension. The legal loopholes left in 1555 were the direct architectural blueprints for the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, which would later decimate a third of the population in the German states. This demonstrates how a peace treaty can often be a calculated postponement of a larger catastrophe. The cultural shift, from honor to interest. The Renaissance saw the slow death of the medieval concept of chivalric honor and the rise of reason of state, ragione de Estado. Social change. The minor nobility, once defined by their ability to provide armored cavalry, found themselves obsolete due to the rise of tercio infantry and gunpowder. To survive, they had to transform into courtiers and administrators. The human impact. This led to a crisis of identity. For the first time, the self was seen as something that could be curated and performed for advancement. We see this in the popularity of manuals like Castiglione's The Courtier, which taught people how to hide their true intentions behind a mask of nonchalance, sprezzatura. The fact of modernity. This was the beginning of the performative state, where public image became a strategic asset. Diplomacy became a game of encrypted codes and double meanings, a far cry from the direct, blood kinship ties of the previous centuries. The conflict of the New World economy. The discovery of the Americas is usually framed as an age of discovery. For the European economy, however, it was an inflationary shock. The internal debate. In Spain, the School of Salamanca, early economists, debated the morality of price increases. They were the first to realize that the value of money was not intrinsic, but tied to its scarcity. The failure of strategy. The Spanish crown used the gold and silver of the Americas not to build an industrial base, but to pay off debts to Italian and German bankers and to fund endless wars of prestige. The consequence. The wealth of the Renaissance actually impoverished the Spanish people in the long run. By 1600, Spain was declaring bankruptcy repeatedly, while its neighbors, the Dutch and the English, were building a new kind of power based on joint stock companies, shifting power from monarchs to investors. To understand the scientific revolution, we must first strip away the idea that it was a sudden eureka moment. It was a slow, grueling process of institutional friction. The dismantling of medieval social structures didn't happen because people suddenly became smarter, but because the old methods of verifying truth could no longer support the weight of a changing world. In the medieval structure, knowledge was top-down. Truth was a matter of inheritance. You looked to the Bible, to Aristotle, or to the Church Fathers. If your eyes saw something that contradicted the text, your eyes were considered deceived. The scientific revolution inverted this, placing the individual observer at the center of reality. The collapse of the Aristotelian hierarchy. The medieval social order was mirrored in the medieval map of the heavens. According to the Aristotelian Ptolemaic system, the Earth was at the center, surrounded by perfect, unchanging celestial spheres. This wasn't just astronomy, it was a social blueprint. Everything had a natural place. Just as the sun was higher than the moon, the king was higher than the peasant by divine design. The turning point, the supernova of 1572. When a new star appeared in the constellation Cassiopeia, it was a systemic shock. According to the prevailing worldview, the heavens were perfect and immutable. Change only happened in the corrupt sublunar world, Earth. The decision, Tycho Brahe, a Danish nobleman, spent nights measuring the parallax of this star. He proved it was farther away than the moon. The consequence, if the heavens could change, then the perfect order was a myth. This planted a seed of doubt. If the celestial hierarchy was flawed, perhaps the social hierarchy was not as divinely fixed as the authorities claimed. The democratization of proof, the Royal Society. In the mid-17th century, a fundamental shift occurred in how decisions were made and facts were established. We see this most clearly in the founding of the Royal Society of London, 1660. Their motto, nullius in verba, meaning take nobody's word for it, was a direct assault on medieval social structures. The internal shift. Before this, gentlemen didn't work with their hands. Manual labor was for the lower classes. However, the new science required building air pumps, grinding lenses, and dissecting carcasses. This created a new social space where a nobleman and a clockmaker might stand over the same experiment. Truth was no longer established by who was the highest-ranking person in the room, but by what could be replicated in front of witnesses. The human impact. This birthed the expert. Power began to shift from those with bloodlines to those with technical competence. The state started to rely on natural philosophers for navigation, ballistics, and mining, creating a new middle-class path to influence that bypassed the traditional nobility. The anatomy of power, William Harvey and the body politic. The dismantling of medieval structures even extended into how people understood their own bodies, which in turn affected how they viewed the state. The fact, in 1628, Harvey published his discovery of the circulation of blood. In the context, the medieval view, Galenic, was that blood was consumed by the body like fuel and constantly replenished by the liver. It was a linear, wasteful system. Harvey proved it was a closed circuit, driven by the heart acting as a pump. This shifted the metaphor of the state. Rulers had long used the body politic metaphor, where the king was the head and the peasants were the feet. Harvey's discovery suggested a functional, integrated system where every part was necessary for the circulation of the whole. It moved the needle toward a more mechanical view of society, leading eventually to the idea that a state could be engineered or improved through policy, rather than just endured as a divine decree. The price of clarity, the trial of Galileo, 1633. We must look at the trial of Galileo not just as a simple science versus religion trope, but as a clash of jurisdictions. The strategic mistake. Galileo didn't just report his sightings of Jupiter's moons or the phases of Venus. He wrote his dialogue concerning the two chief world systems in Italian, not Latin. By writing in the common tongue, he bypassed the academic and ecclesiastical gatekeepers. He was leaking high-level intellectual secrets to the public. The church's crackdown wasn't just about the earth moving, it was about the loss of control over the narrative. If any man with a telescope could redefine the universe, the central authority of the papacy was functionally obsolete. Galileo was silenced, but the alternative had already been seen. The cat was out of the bag. You could not unsee the moons of Jupiter. To maintain our focus on the structural evolution of Europe, we should examine the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648. This was not merely a religious conflict. It was the violent final collapse of the medieval feudal order and the traumatic birth of the modern sovereign state. For a European audience, this period is often the missing link that explains why the continent is organized into the borders we see today. It was a moment where the intellectual shifts of the scientific revolution and humanism met the cold reality of military logistics and state survival. The trigger, the failure of the binary system. We previously discussed the Peace of Augsburg, 1555, and how its failure to recognize anyone but Catholics and Lutherans created a pressure cooker. By 1618, the Holy Roman Empire was a gridlock of legal disputes. The turning point, the defenestration of Prague, 1618. When Protestant officials in Bohemia threw two Catholic imperial representatives out of a window, it wasn't just an act of local rebellion, it was a rejection of the emperor's centralized authority. The miscalculation. The emperor, Ferdinand II, believed he could use this local conflict to finally reimpose Catholic uniformity and imperial power over all German states. He underestimated the degree to which other European powers, France, Sweden, and Denmark, viewed a strong, unified Holy Roman Empire as an existential threat to their own interest of state. The professionalization of violence. Albrecht von Wallenstein. The war quickly moved beyond ideology and became a matter of market mechanics. This is where we see the human impact through the lens of those who profited from chaos. The individual. Albrecht von Wallenstein was a minor nobleman who became the war's ultimate entrepreneur. He realized that the emperor couldn't afford a massive standing army, so he offered a turnkey solution. He would raise, equip, and lead an army of 50,000 men at no initial cost to the crown. The decision. His method was war feeds war. This is how the army didn't rely on supply lines from home. They systematically extracted contributions, legalized looting, from every territory they occupied, regardless of whether that territory was friend or foe. The consequence. This turned the war into a self-sustaining industry. The soldiers' loyalty was to their paymaster, not a cause or a king. It led to a total breakdown of civilian safety, where the distinction between army and organized crime vanished. The paradox. Cardinal Richelieu's logic. One of the most revealing internal contradictions of the war was the role of France. France was a Catholic power, led by a prince of the church, Cardinal Richelieu. The fact. Richelieu brought France into the war on the side of the Protestants. The strategic background. Richelieu prioritized raison d'etat, reason of state, over religious solidarity. He feared the Habsburg encirclement, Spain to the south, the empire to the east. By funding Protestant armies, he ensured Germany remained divided and weak. The impact. This marked the definitive end of Christendom as a political entity. From this point forward, European politics would be dictated by the balance of power, not by religious decree. The human impact, the great depopulation. For the average person in Central Europe, this was an apocalypse that lasted 30 decades. Survival and contradiction. In parts of Germany, the population fell by over 50%. This wasn't just from combat, it was from the shadow of war. Typhus, plague, and man-made famine caused by the constant movement of troops. Social shift. The sheer loss of life forced a restructuring of the economy. With fewer peasants to work the land, those who survived gained a tiny sliver of leverage, while the lower nobility, whose lands were scorched, became increasingly dependent on the centralizing state for military commissions or bureaucratic roles. The final result. The Peace of Westphalia, 1648. The war didn't end with a heroic victory, but with total exhaustion. The resulting treaties created the Westphalian system, which remains the foundation of global politics today. Sovereignty. It established that a state has exclusive authority over its own territory. No outside power, like the Pope or the Emperor, had a legal right to intervene in another state's internal affairs. The end of universalism. The dream of a single unified Christian empire was dead. Europe was now a collection of competing secularized interests. The missed alternative. Could a unified United States of Germany have emerged in the 1600s? The war ensured this wouldn't happen for another 200 years, keeping Central Europe a fractured battlefield for the ambitions of France and Austria. To maintain our trajectory of examining structural shifts rather than heroic myths, we will focus on the Dutch Republic in the 17th century. This is perhaps the most critical missing layer in understanding the modern West. While the rest of Europe was still bleeding out from the 30 Years' War and clinging to the idea that land and gold were the only forms of power, a tiny, flooded corner of the continent invented a new way to organize human ambition: global finance. This was the first time in history that a state's power was built not on the size of its king's ego, but on the perceived stability of its institutions. The strategic background. The War of Sovereign Credit. The Dutch were engaged in an 80-year struggle for independence from the Spanish Empire. On paper, they should have lost within months. Spain had the world's most powerful infantry and an endless supply of American silver. The decision. The Dutch realized they could not outmuscle Spain, so they decided to outfinance them. In 1602, they chartered the Dutch East India Company, VOC. The innovation. This was the world's first multinational joint stock corporation. Instead of a king funding a voyage, ordinary citizens, butchers, bakers, and widows could buy shares. The consequence. This decentralized the risk of war and trade. If a Spanish ship sank, the Spanish treasury took the hit. If a Dutch ship sank, the loss was spread across thousands of private investors. The Dutch Republic effectively turned the entire population into a venture capital firm. The turning point. The invention of the Bourse, 1602. In Amsterdam, the Dutch created a permanent marketplace for these shares. This was the birth of the stock exchange. The mechanic. They moved from a commodity economy, trading physical things like grain or wool, to a speculative economy, trading the expectation of future profit. The internal contradiction. This new system relied entirely on trust, the root of the word credit. If people believed the VOC would succeed, the shares went up. This created the first financial bubbles, most famously the tulip mania of the 1330s. The fact, while the tulip crash is often treated as a funny anecdote about crazy gardeners, its historical significance is deeper. It was the first time a society had to grapple with the virtual economy, the realization that prices could be completely disconnected from physical reality. Power structures. The burgher versus the prince. The Dutch Republic was a radical outlier in European power structures. It was a regulated anarchy. The conflict, there was a constant internal tug-of-war between the Orangists, who wanted a strong military leader or stadtholder, and the States Party, the wealthy merchants who wanted a decentralized republic. The strategic impact. The merchants realized a king was a bad investment. Kings tended to start expensive wars for honor. Merchants preferred managed conflicts that protected trade routes. The result. Because the merchants held the purse strings, the Dutch Republic became the most religiously and intellectually tolerant place in Europe. They didn't permit Jews or radical philosophers like Baruch Spinoza out of moral kindness, but out of pragmatism. Persecution was bad for business. It drove away skilled labor and capital. Human impact. The first middle-class lifestyle. The Renaissance in Italy was for the 1%. The Dutch Golden Age was for the 15%. Social shift. For the first time, we see the rise of the private home. In the rest of Europe, art was massive, designed for cathedrals or palaces to overawe the public. In the Netherlands, art was small, designed to hang in a merchant's dining room. The art of fact. This is why Dutch painting, Vermeer and Rembrandt, focuses on domesticity, maps, and scientific instruments. It was in celebration of the material world. The downside.
This prosperity was built on a brutal colonial machine. The same efficient corporate structure that brought spices to Amsterdam was responsible for the systematic displacement and slaughter of populations in the Spice Islands, modern-day Indonesia. The soothing narrative of the Dutch home was paid for by the first truly industrialized form of colonial exploitation. The long-term consequence, the Dutch template. By the late 1600s, the Dutch had proven that a small, resource-poor nation could dominate the world through credit and naval technology. When the English invited the Dutch leader, William of Orange, to take their throne in 1688, the Glorious Revolution, he didn't just bring his army, he brought the Amsterdam financial system. The founding of the Bank of England in 1694 was a direct copy-paste of Dutch mechanics. This is the moment the financial revolution merged with the scientific revolution, creating the engine that would eventually drive the industrial revolution.
To maintain our trajectory toward the structures of the modern world, we will examine the Enlightenment's attempt to apply scientific laws to human government. This was not a period of polite dinner parties, but a high-stakes intellectual demolition of the divine right of kings. Following the scientific revolution, thinkers began to ask a dangerous question. If the universe is a clockwork mechanism governed by laws, like gravity, why should human society be governed by the whims of a single fallible man? The individual. Thomas Hobbes versus John Locke. The debate over the social contract was born out of the trauma of the 17th century civil wars. It wasn't about freedom in the modern sense. It was about security and legitimacy. Thomas Hobbes, Leviathan, 1651, writing during the chaos of the English Civil War, Hobbes concluded that human nature was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. The decision. He argued that people would willingly trade all their rights to an absolute sovereign, the Leviathan, in exchange for one thing: physical safety. John Locke, Two Treatises of Government, 1689, writing after the Dutch-backed Glorious Revolution, Locke offered a different scientific observation. He argued that humans were born as tabula rasa, blank slates, and possessed natural rights: life, liberty, and property. The consequence: Locke flipped the script on power. He argued that government was not a gift from God, but a fiduciary trust. If the trustee, the king, violated the terms, the shareholders, the people, had a legal right to fire him. This was the application of Dutch corporate logic to the state. The turning point, the Encyclopédie, 1751. If the printing press was the hardware of the Renaissance, the Encyclopédie, edited by Denis Diderot, was the software of the Enlightenment. The strategy. This was a massive, multi-volume project to catalog all human knowledge, but it had a hidden political agenda. By placing an entry on political authority next to an entry on pin-making or the geometry of prisms, Diderot was subtly suggesting that everything, religion, monarchy, and craft, was subject to the same human scrutiny. The conflict. The French crown and the church repeatedly banned the project. They understood that information symmetry was a threat. If a baker understood the mechanics of the state as well as a minister, the mystique of power would evaporate. The impact. It created the public intellectual. For the first time, philosophers like Voltaire and Rousseau became international celebrities whose influence rivaled that of traditional diplomats. Power structures. The enlightened despot. A fascinating internal contradiction of this era was the rise of rulers like Frederick the Great of Prussia and Catherine the Great of Russia. These were absolute monarchs who loved Enlightenment philosophy. The paradox. They used Enlightenment rationality to make their states more efficient, but not more free. They modernized their bureaucracies, abolished torture, and promoted religious tolerance, not because they were kind, but because a tolerant, healthy, and educated population paid more taxes and provided better soldiers.
The result? It created the state machine. The king was no longer the owner of the country, he was the first servant of the state. This shift in language was subtle but permanent. Power was now tied to function, not blood. Human impact, the invention of the public. For the ordinary person, the Enlightenment manifested in the coffee house. These were the internet hubs of the 18th century. Social shift. In a tavern, people got drunk. In a coffee house, they stayed awake and talked. Because coffee was expensive, these spaces brought together merchants, writers, and junior officials. The breakdown of hierarchy. In a coffee house, the best argument was supposed to win regardless of the speaker's social rank. This created a new social class, the public. Rulers began to realize they had to manage public opinion for the first time in history. The cost of progress. While the Enlightenment preached universal rights, it simultaneously developed the first scientific justifications for racism and colonialism. As thinkers tried to classify the natural world, they began to classify human beings into hierarchies to justify the continued economic reliance on chattel slavery. This is a cold, uncomfortable fact. The age of reason and the age of slavery were two sides of the same coin.
To understand why the intellectual debates of the coffee houses suddenly turned into the violence of the late 18th century, we must look at the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763. This is the moment where the abstract theories of the Enlightenment met the brutal global reality of total war. For a modern observer, this conflict is the true World War I. It was the first time that a decision made in a palace in London or Versailles resulted in a skirmish in the forests of Ohio, a naval battle off the coast of India, and a siege in the Philippines. The strategic background: the bankruptcy of prestige. By the mid-1700s, the balance of power established that Westphalia had become a complex, expensive machine. War was no longer about knights, it was about infantry, artillery, and logistics. The problem, maintaining a professional army required a massive, constant flow of cash. Empires were operating on the Dutch template of credit, but they were over-leveraging themselves. The turning point, the diplomatic revolution of 1756. In a shocking reversal of centuries of enmity, France and Austria, the Habsburgs, became allies. This forced Great Britain to align with Prussia. This wasn't about ideology, it was a cold-blooded recalculation of interests that left the continent's borders exactly where they were, but moved the real conflict to the colonies. Power structures, the professionalized death machine. The war saw the perfection of the linear tactics that would define the era. This was the scientific revolution applied to killing. The mechanic, soldiers were trained to stand in perfectly straight lines, 3 deep, and fire rhythmic volleys. This required a level of discipline that turned the human being into a literal cog in a machine. The individual, Frederick the Great, he used oblique order maneuvers, mathematical precision on the battlefield, to defeat armies twice his size. But he treated his men as expendable assets. His famous quote to his retreating troops, "Rascals, do you want to live forever?" perfectly captures the shift from the noble warrior to the statistical unit. The fact, by 1763, Great Britain emerged as the world's dominant naval power, but at a catastrophic cost. The national debt had nearly doubled. The human impact, the missed alternative, and the cause and effect that led directly to the American and French revolutions. The decision: to pay for the global victory, the British and French crowns had to find new revenue. They turned to their populations with new, rationalized taxes, like the Stamp Act in the colonies or the salt tax in France. The conflict of identity. The people, who had been reading Locke and the Encyclopedia, no longer felt like subjects but like citizens. They were being asked to pay for the reason of state without having a voice in that state's decisions. The consequence, the war removed the French threat from North America, which ironically made the American colonists feel they no longer needed British protection.
The social contract was being renegotiated, and the pen was being replaced by the bayonet. The long-term consequence, the debt of revolution. The French crown's decision to support the American war, purely to spite Britain and restore the balance of power, was the final nail in its own coffin. Internal contradiction? Louis XVI spent so much on the American war that the French state's interest payments alone eventually exceeded its entire tax revenue. The pivot, by 1789, the king was forced to call the Estates General, a medieval legislative body, to ask for more money. He tried to solve a 17th century financial crisis with a 13th century political tool. The system shattered. The shift from land to labor. As the empires fought for territory, a deeper change was occurring in the background. In Britain, the Enclosure Acts were forcing peasants off common land and into the cities. The social reality? This created a desperate, mobile workforce. At the same time, the scientific interest in geology and chemistry led to the increased mining of coal. The human result, the gentleman scientist of the Royal Society, was now being replaced by the industrialist. The power structure was shifting again, from the man who owned the land to the man who owned the machines. To maintain our commitment to analyzing the structural evolution of Europe, we will examine the French Revolution not as a sudden outburst of liberty, but as a catastrophic failure of the state to manage the transition from a feudal hierarchy to a modern bureaucratic machine. For a European audience, this is the moment where the theories of the Enlightenment were tested in the laboratory of real-world politics. The result was a chilling realization. Once you dismantle the divine basis of power, the only thing left to hold a society together is the will of the people, a concept that proved difficult to define and even harder to control. The strategic background, the debt trap. By 1789, the French state was functionally insolvent. As we noted, the cost of the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution had created a debt that could not be serviced under the existing tax code. The structural failure. In the Ancien regime, the wealthiest segments of society, the nobility and the clergy, were largely exempt from taxes. The burden fell on the Third Estate, merchants, artisans, and peasants. The decision. King Louis XVI attempted to bypass the local parliaments and implement a universal land tax. The nobility resisted, using the language of the Enlightenment, ironically claiming they were protecting liberty against a tyrant to protect their own wallets. The consequence: the king was forced to call the Estates General. By bringing together representatives from all classes for the first time in 174 years, he inadvertently created a forum where the Third Estate realized they held the economic power of the nation. The turning point, the tennis court oath, June 1789. This was the moment where everything changed. When the Third Estate was locked out of their meeting hall, they moved to a nearby indoor tennis court and swore not to leave until they had written a constitution. The shift in legitimacy. This was the death of the divine right of kings. The delegates were declaring that sovereignty resided in the nation, not the person of the monarch. The missed alternative. Had Louis XVI immediately embraced a constitutional monarchy similar to the English model, the following decade of slaughter might have been avoided. Instead, he vacillated, sending mixed signals that convinced the public he was plotting a military crackdown. Power structures, the Committee of Public Safety. As the revolution progressed, it faced external threats from the monarchies of Europe and internal civil war. This led to a new, terrifying power structure, the Revolutionary Tribunal. The individual, Maximilien Robespierre. He was the ultimate Enlightenment fundamentalist. He believed that for virtue to prevail, terror was a necessary tool. The logic of the guillotine. The guillotine itself was an Enlightenment invention, designed to be a humane and rational way to execute people, treating every neck equally regardless of social rank. The paradox. In the name of liberty, the Committee of Public Safety suspended all civil liberties. They created the first modern police state, where suspicion was enough to warrant death. This demonstrates how a movement dedicated to human rights can become the very tyranny it sought to overthrow when it prioritizes ideology over individual life. Human impact, the levée en masse. The revolution changed the very definition of a soldier. In the previous era, wars were fought by professionals. In 1793, the French Republic decreed the levée en masse, the first universal conscription. The social reality. Every citizen was now a soldier. This was the birth of nationalism. People were no longer fighting for a king's territory, they were fighting for the fatherland, la patrie. The consequence: this allowed France to field armies of unprecedented size, over 750,000 men. These citizen soldiers, fueled by ideological fervor and the promise of meritocratic promotion, overwhelmed the professional armies of Europe. It changed the scale of warfare forever, moving from limited war to total war. The long-term consequence: the Napoleonic Code. The chaos of the revolution eventually paved the way for a strong man to restore order, Napoleon Bonaparte. While he was a dictator, he solidified the structural changes of the revolution through the Napoleonic Code, 1804. Legal equality. It abolished feudal privileges and established that all male citizens were equal before the law. Secularization. It codified the separation of church and state in legal matters. Bureaucratic merit. It ensured that government jobs were based on ability rather than birth. This code was exported across Europe by Napoleon's Grande Armée. Even after Napoleon's defeat, the old aristocracies found it impossible to put the feudal toothpaste back in the tube. The administrative foundation of the modern European state was now set.
To maintain our focus on the structural shifts that define the modern era, we must now examine the Industrial Revolution. This was not just a collection of inventions like the steam engine. It was a fundamental rupture in human history. For the first time since the invention of agriculture 10,000 years prior, humanity broke the biological old regime. Before this, every ounce of energy used by a society came from the sun, via food for muscles or wood for fire, wind or water. Industry allowed us to tap into stored sunlight in the form of coal, fundamentally changing the relationship between human labor, time, and the state. The strategic background. Why Britain? We must look at the specific, non-mythical reasons why this shift began in a small island nation rather than in the more populous and wealthy China or France. The factor of dear labor and cheap energy. In 18th century Britain, wages were the highest in the world, while coal was exceptionally cheap and accessible. The decision. Because labor was expensive, British entrepreneurs had a massive financial incentive to build machines that could replace human hands. In China, where labor was plentiful and cheap, there was no business case for a steam engine. The geography of finance. As we discussed with the Dutch template, Britain had the most sophisticated banking system in the world. An inventor didn't need a king's permission, he needed a loan. The turning point. The Watt steam engine, 1776. While James Watt is the hero of the narrative, the structural reality is the separate condenser. The mechanic, early steam engines, Newcomen, were incredibly inefficient, only used to pump water out of coal mines. Watt's redesign made the engine efficient enough to power factories anywhere, not just at the mouth of a mine or beside a river. The consequence? This led to the spatial reorganization of humanity. People were pulled out of the seasonal cycles of the countryside and shoved into the 24-hour artificial light of the factory. The clock replaced the sun as the arbiter of human life. Power structures, the rise of the captain of industry. The Industrial Revolution created a new elite that did not fit into the old Westphalian or feudal categories. The shift, wealth was no longer based on owning land, which is finite, but on owning capital and means of production, which can be scaled. Internal contradiction.
This new class of industrialists demanded political power, leading to the Great Reform Act of 1832 in Britain. They used the Enlightenment language of efficiency and utility to dismantle the old aristocratic protections like the Corn Laws. The result? The state stopped being a protector of the social order and started being a facilitator of economic growth. Laws were rewritten to protect limited liability and patents, prioritizing the movement of goods over the stability of communities. Human impact, the Great Divergence, and the urban proletariat. The most profound impact was on the physical body and the family unit. The social reality, in the 1840s, the life expectancy of a worker in a factory town like Manchester was roughly 17 years, compared to 38 years in the rural countryside. The industrial city was a biological disaster, crowded, unsanitary, and disconnected from traditional support systems. The birth of the social question. This misery was not invisible. It led to the birth of socialism and Marxism. These weren't just ideas, they were reactions to the tangible fact that while the nation was getting wealthier, the worker was being physically degraded. The global impact. This created the Great Divergence. Nations that industrialized, the West, suddenly possessed a 10-to-1 military and economic advantage over those that didn't. This was the true engine of 19th century imperialism, not civilizing missions, but the insatiable need for raw materials and new markets to keep the machines running. The long-term consequence, the administrative state. To manage the chaos of industrialization, the state had to become scientific. Statistics. The word statistics comes from science of the state. Rulers began to track births, deaths, and diseases to manage their workforce. Standardized state-funded education was designed to create a predictable citizen. The environment. This era marked the beginning of the Anthropocene, the first time human economic activity began to alter the chemistry of the atmosphere, a consequence that would not be fully understood for another century.
To maintain our trajectory of analyzing the structural evolution of power, we will examine the unification of Germany, 1862 to 1871. This was not a romantic story of national awakening, but a cold-blooded masterclass in realpolitik, the politics of reality. Under the guidance of Otto von Bismarck, Prussia used the tools of the Industrial Revolution, railways, telegraphs, and needle guns, to dismantle the old Westphalian balance of power and replace it with a new destabilizing force, the industrial military superstate. The individual, Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck was not a German nationalist in the modern sense. He was a Prussian loyalist. He viewed the liberal, idealistic revolutions of 1848 with contempt. The decision. Bismarck realized that if the Prussian monarchy didn't lead the unification of Germany, the liberal middle class eventually would. He decided to revolutionize from above. The strategy. He famously told the Prussian parliament that the great questions of the day would not be settled by speeches and majority decisions, but by blood and iron. This was a direct rejection of Enlightenment deliberation in favor of industrial and military efficiency. The turning point, the Franco-Prussian War, 1870 to 1871. Bismarck needed an external enemy to weld the disparate German states together. He found it in Napoleonic France. The Ems Dispatch, a masterclass in manipulation. Bismarck edited a telegram from the Prussian king to make it appear as though the king had insulted the French ambassador. He leaked it to the press, knowing it would provoke the French emperor, Napoleon III, into declaring war. The mechanic. Prussia used its superior general staff system, a bureaucratic innovation where professional officers studied war as a science, and its state-owned railways to mobilize faster than any army in history. The consequence? France was crushed. At the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles, the very heart of French prestige, the German Empire was proclaimed. This was a deliberate humiliation that shifted the center of European gravity from Paris to Berlin. Power structures, the marriage of rye and iron. The new German Empire was a state-of-the-art power structure built on an internal contradiction. The alliance,
Bismarck brokered a deal between the Junkers, the old landed aristocracy, the Rye, and the industrialists, the new billionaire class, the Iron. The logic: the Junkers kept their control over the army and the civil service, while the industrialists were given protective tariffs and a unified market. The result: Germany became an industrial powerhouse that bypassed Britain's slow organic growth. By the 1890s, Germany was outproducing Britain in steel and chemicals, creating a massive security dilemma for the rest of Europe. Human impact: the invention of the welfare state. Bismarck was the first to realize that to prevent a socialist revolution from below, the state had to provide for the workers' basic security. The fact: between 1883 and 1889, Germany introduced the world's first national sickness insurance, accident insurance, and old age pensions. The realpolitik: this wasn't done out of humanitarianism. Bismarck called it state socialism. His goal was to make the working class dependent on the state rather than on labor unions or revolutionary parties. The shift: the citizens' relationship with the state changed from one of loyalty to a person to a contractual dependence on a system. This is the blueprint for the modern European social model. The long-term consequence: the tinderbox. The unification of Germany fundamentally broke the European system. The French trauma: the loss of Alsace-Lorraine created a permanent revanchism in France, a deep generational need for revenge. The arms race: to keep up with German industrial output, Britain and France had to militarize their own economies, leading to the dreadnought naval race. The end of neutrality: Bismarck's complex web of secret treaties eventually failed. Europe was divided into two rigid, armed camps. The system was now so efficient and so tightly wound that a single localized conflict could and would trigger a global catastrophe. To maintain our focus on how structural systems eventually override human agency, we will examine the July Crisis of 1914. This is the moment where the professionalized state and the industrial machine we have been tracing finally collided with a fatal flaw: inflexible logistics. In the mainstream narrative, this is often portrayed as a tragedy of errors. In reality, it was a systemic failure. The European powers had built a world so efficient and so rationalized that they had stripped themselves of the ability to stop a war once the First Order was signed. The strategic background: the cult of the offensive. Following the Prussian victories of 1870, every military staff in Europe adopted the science of war. They believed that with modern railways and telegraphs, the side that mobilized first would win. The decision: this led to the creation of the Schlieffen Plan in Germany. It was a mathematical blueprint that required Germany to invade neutral Belgium and knock out France in exactly 42 days before turning to fight Russia. The internal contradiction: the plan was a masterpiece of logistics, but a disaster of diplomacy. It treated the violation of Belgian neutrality, a scrap of paper that Britain was treaty-bound to protect, as a mere engineering problem rather than a political catastrophe. The turning point: the blank check, July 5, 1914. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo, it was a localized act of terror. The world did not immediately plunge into war. The mechanism: Austria-Hungary, seeking to crush Serbian nationalism, asked Germany for support. Kaiser Wilhelm II issued the blank check, promising unconditional support. The miscalculation: the Kaiser believed that a firm stand would deter Russia. He was using 18th century prestige logic in a 20th century alliance system. Because of the secret treaties we discussed in the Bismarck era, Russia could not abandon Serbia without losing its own status as a great power. Power structures: the tyranny of the timetable. This is the most critical missing layer for understanding 1914. Once the Russian Tsar ordered a partial mobilization to signal his intent, the German military establishment panicked. The fact, in 1914, mobilization was not just getting ready, it was a massive, irreversible movement of millions of men and horses via thousands of synchronized train schedules. The result? There was no such thing as a halfway mobilization. If Germany waited while Russia moved its troops, the Schlieffen Plan would fail. The generals told the politicians that the machine is in motion. The consequence, diplomacy was literally outpaced by the speed of the steam engine. Rulers who wanted to de-escalate, like the Tsar and the Kaiser in their willy-nilly telegrams, found that they were no longer in control of their own governments. The military staff had replaced the diplomat. Human impact, the death of the 19th century individual. For the ordinary European, the start of the war was a psychological rupture. The social reality, in 1914, the citizen soldier we saw in the French Revolution had become the conscripted unit. Men who had spent decades in the scientific education systems of Bismarck or the French Third Republic marched to war believing it would be over before the leaves fall. The failure of reason. The Enlightenment promised that reason would lead to progress. Instead, reason had led to the industrialization of slaughter. The same chemical factories that produced fertilizer for the Green Revolution were now producing chlorine gas and high explosives. The long-term impact. This was the end of the liberal optimism of the 1800s. The war didn't just kill 20 million people, it killed the idea that Western civilization was inherently rational or superior. The final result? The total state. The war forced the final evolution of the state power structure, the command economy. Centralization. To survive, governments took total control over labor, food, and industry. The distinction between civilian and military vanished. Propaganda. To keep populations willing to endure the horrors of the trenches, states created the first modern Ministry of Information. Public opinion was no longer just managed in coffeehouses, it was industrially manufactured. The shift in gender roles. With millions of men at the front, women moved into the factories and the bureaucracy. This was a structural shift that could not be undone, leading directly to the post-war suffrage movements.
To continue our structural analysis, we must examine the Treaty of Versailles, 1919, and the subsequent interwar period. This was the moment where the scientific and rational aspirations of the 19th century collapsed into a state of permanent crisis. The peace was not a failure of emotion or greed, but a failure of systemic reconciliation. The victors tried to apply 18th century territorial logic and 19th century financial logic to a 20th century world that had been fundamentally changed by total war. The strategic background, the Carthaginian illusion. The negotiators at Versailles, the Big Three, Wilson, Lloyd George, and Clemenceau, faced a structural impossibility. They needed to punish Germany enough to satisfy their traumatized home populations, but not so much that they destroyed the economic heart of Europe. The decision. Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. This was not merely an insult, it was a legal necessity. In order to demand reparations, compensation for the war, the Allies had to establish a legal basis for liability. The financial mechanic. The reparations were set at 132 billion gold marks. This was an attempt to bridge the gap between the debt the Allies owed to the United States and the damage done to France. The consequence. It created a permanent grievance. By making the peace about guilt rather than stability, the treaty undermined the moderate democratic elements within Germany, the Weimar Republic, before they even began to govern. The turning point. The collapse of the buffer states.
One of the key Enlightenment-inspired goals of the treaty was national self-determination. This was the idea that every ethnic group should have its own state. The structural reality. In Central and Eastern Europe, ethnic groups were not neatly separated. They were marble-caked. Creating a new Poland, Czechoslovakia, or Yugoslavia meant that every new state contained a significant, unhappy minority, often German or Hungarian. The missed alternative. Instead of a United States of Europe or a meaningful League of Nations, the treaty created a series of small, economically weak buffer states. The result: these states were too small to defend themselves against a resurgent Germany or Russia, but just large enough to engage in their own local ethnic conflicts. The old empires were replaced by a new instability. Power structures. The rise of the totalitarian alternative. During the 1920s and 30s, the failure of the liberal capitalist model led to the rise of two competing structural fixes: fascism and Bolshevism. The logic of totalitarianism. Both systems were modern in the most brutal sense. They took the total state mechanics of World War I, censorship, command economies, and mass mobilization, and made them permanent. The individual. Benito Mussolini. He provided the blueprint. He realized that in the age of the public, a leader didn't need a divine right, he needed a mass movement. Fascism was the aestheticization of politics, using the tools of industrial propaganda to make the citizen feel like part of a powerful biological machine. Internal contradiction. These regimes were highly efficient at building infrastructure, the Autobahn, and rearming, but they were structurally incapable of peace. Their legitimacy relied on constant struggle and the identification of internal enemies. Human impact. The Great Depression as a systemic reset. The final blow to the post-war order was not a military one, but a financial one: the 1929 crash. The social reality. Because the world was now globally connected through the Dutch-English template of credit, a failure in the New York Stock Exchange resulted in the immediate collapse of the German banking system. The result: unemployment reached 30% in some industrial nations. For the ordinary person, democracy began to look like an expensive luxury that couldn't provide bread. The shift in identity. This era saw the birth of the identity politic. People stopped identifying as citizens of a republic and began identifying by their class, communism, or their race, National Socialism. The reason of the Enlightenment was fully replaced by the mythology of the tribe. The long-term consequence. The road to 1939. By the mid-1930s, the Westphalian balance was gone. The League of Nations had failed because it had no teeth. It was an Enlightenment talking shop in a world of industrial predators. Rearmament became the only way to solve unemployment. The global economy became a war economy in a time of nominal peace. The final miscalculation, the policy of appeasement, was not just cowardice. It was a desperate attempt by Britain and France to maintain a system that no longer existed. They were playing a game of 19th century diplomacy against 20th century ideological totalitarians.
To move from the failed peace of the 1920s into the Second World War, 1939 to 1945, we must view the conflict not as a series of battlefield maps, but as the final, violent resolution of the competing total systems we have been tracing. This was the era where the state and the machine became indistinguishable. The war was total, not just in its geographic reach, but in its structural penetration of every facet of human existence. It was the ultimate test of three competing blueprints for the modern world: liberal democracy, fascism, and communism. The strategic background, the logic of extermination. Unlike the First World War, which was primarily a conflict over territory and prestige, the Second World War was an ideological war of annihilation. The decision, Operation Barbarossa, 1941. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union, it was not a conventional military campaign. It was a war of existence, Vernichtungskrieg. The structural reality. Hitler's General Plan Ost aimed to systematically dismantle the Slavic populations of Eastern Europe to create Lebensraum, living space, for a Germanic empire.
This was the scientific racism of the Enlightenment taken to its most horrific industrial conclusion. The result, the Eastern Front became the epicenter of the war, where 80% of German military casualties occurred. It was here that the machine was most hungry, consuming millions of lives in a war of attrition that broke the back of the Nazi state. The turning point, the arsenal of democracy. While the Eastern Front was a war of blood, the Western Front, led by the United States and Great Britain, was a war of industrial throughput. The individual, Franklin D. Roosevelt, he realized that the war would be won in the factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh as much as on the beaches of Normandy. The mechanic, the War Production Board. The U.S. government took the total state lessons of the 1930s and applied them to a capitalist framework. They didn't just ask for tanks, they subsidized the creation of entirely new industries, like synthetic rubber and radar. The fact, by 1944, the United States was producing more aircraft and ships than all the Axis powers combined. This was the triumph of logistical supremacy. The management of the war became a matter of statistical flows, where victory was mathematically inevitable once the production curves crossed. Power structures, the birth of big science. The war catalyzed a permanent shift in how knowledge and power interact. We move from the gentleman scientist to the military-industrial complex. The Manhattan Project. This was the first time a state spent billions of dollars on a theoretical physics project with the goal of creating a weapon. It required tens of thousands of people working in secret shadow cities like Oak Ridge and Los Alamos. The successful test of the atomic bomb in 1945 changed the nature of sovereignty. A state's power was no longer just about its army or its economy, but about its technological frontier. The shift, this birthed the expert state, where scientists, engineers, and strategists became the high priests of the modern government, often operating outside the view of the general public. Human impact, the people's war, and the welfare state. For the ordinary European, the war destroyed the old class-based social order for good. Social shift in Britain, the experience of the Blitz and total rationing created a sense of shared sacrifice. People realized that if the state could mobilize everything to win a war, it could surely mobilize everything to provide healthcare and housing. The decision, the Beveridge Report in 1942. In the middle of the war, Britain plans for the peace. They proposed a cradle-to-grave social security system. This was the birth of the modern welfare state. The contradiction, while the war was a horror, it was also a moment of intense social leveling. The common man became the hero of the narrative, and after 1945, any government that failed to provide for his basic security was seen as illegitimate. The long-term consequence, the bipolar world. In 1945, the European great power system, which had lasted since the Renaissance, was dead. The decentered continent. Europe was no longer the actor in its own story. It was the theater for two new superpowers, the USA and the USSR. The nuclear shadow. The invention of the atomic bomb meant that total war was no longer a viable policy. This led to the Cold War, a period where competition was moved to the spheres of proxy wars, espionage, and space exploration. The decolonization shock. Weakened by the war, the old European empires, Britain, France, and the Netherlands, could no longer hold their colonies. The map of the world exploded from 50 nations to nearly 200, creating the global South and a new era of international relations. To understand the structural evolution of the modern era, we must examine the Cold War and the simultaneous project of European integration. This was the period where the machine of the state became so sophisticated and dangerous that the primary goal of leadership shifted from winning to management. The world was no longer a collection of independent players, but a binary system governed by two competing technocratic models. For Europe, this meant the loss of global hegemony, but the birth of a radical new experiment in post-nationalism. The strategic background, the logic of containment. In 1947, U.S. diplomat George Kennan articulated the long telegram. He argued that the Soviet Union was not a traditional empire, but a revolutionary state that could only be stopped by a long-term, patient, but firm and vigilant containment. The Mechanic, the Marshall Plan, 1948. This was not just a humanitarian gift, it was a strategic application of the Dutch-English template. The US realized that a starving, broken Europe would fall to communism. By injecting $13 billion of capital, they tied European economies to the US dollar and the capitalist system. The result? This created a security umbrella. With the US providing the military defense via NATO, European nations could divert their industrial output away from blood and iron and toward butter and infrastructure. The turning point, the Schuman Declaration, 1950. While the superpowers played a global game of mutual assured destruction, European leaders like Robert Schuman and Jean Monnet made a decision that fundamentally altered the continent's DNA. The innovation, the European Coal and Steel Community, ECSC. Instead of a peace treaty, which had failed in 1919, they proposed a bureaucratic merger. By placing the raw materials of war, coal and steel, under a single high authority, they made war between France and Germany not just unthinkable, but materially impossible. The shift. This was the birth of the supranational power structure. It was a rejection of Westphalian sovereignty. For the first time, nation-states voluntarily gave up a piece of their independence to a board of experts. Power structures. The technocratic equilibrium. The Cold War was the era of the expert. Decisions were made based on game theory, satellite data, and economic modeling. The individual, the bureaucrat. Power shifted from the charismatic orator to the quiet administrator. In both the East and the West, the state became a massive machine for managing quality of life. The internal contradiction. This created a democratic deficit. As the state became more complex, managing nuclear silos, social security, and international trade, the average citizen felt increasingly disconnected from the levers of power. This set the stage for the social upheavals of the late 1960s. Human impact, the consumer revolution, and the Iron Curtain. The war between systems was fought in the kitchen as much as in the laboratory. The social reality, in the West, the 1950s and 60s, the Glorious 30, saw an unprecedented rise in living standards. The industrial machine was now churning out washing machines, cars, and televisions. This created a new consumer identity that transcended old-class boundaries. The contrast. In the East, the state prioritized heavy industry and space exploration over consumer goods. The Berlin Wall, built in 1961, was a physical manifestation of a systemic failure, a state that had to imprison its citizens to keep its machine running. The fact. By the 1970s, the information revolution began to favor the decentralized West. The rigid, top-down Soviet bureaucracy could not adapt to the speed of the silicon chip, creating a structural gap that eventually led to the collapse of the Eastern Bloc. The long-term consequence, the globalized grid. The Cold War ended not with a bang, but with a systemic merger, the unipolar moment. In 1991, the Soviet alternative collapsed. The liberal democratic model appeared to be the final destination of history. The internet and the borderless market, the technologies developed for Cold War defense, the ARPANET, became the foundation for a global, interconnected economy. Power shifted again, from the state to the platform. The return of history. We see today that the Westphalian urge for sovereignty is clashing with the globalized urge for efficiency. The tensions of the Renaissance, identity versus reason, local versus global, have returned in a digital form.
To conclude this structural analysis, we must look at the information revolution and the post-Cold War order, 1991 to present. This is the era where the machine of the state, which we have tracked from the Renaissance printing press to the industrial factory, has been replaced by the digital network. In this final layer, we see the ultimate paradox, a world that is more connected than ever before, yet one where the traditional structures of power, the nation-state and the centralized expert, are facing a profound crisis of legitimacy. The strategic background, the unipolar mirage.
When the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, many believed we had reached a final systemic resolution. The decision, the Maastricht Treaty, 1992. European leaders decided to push the integration project to its logical conclusion. They created the euro, a single currency without a single government. The structural reality, this was the ultimate Enlightenment experiment. The idea that economic reason could override cultural and political differences. The consequence, by separating monetary policy, the euro, from fiscal policy, national budgets, they created a system that was highly efficient in good times, but brittle in crises. The 2008 financial crash revealed this internal contradiction, leading to a decade of tension between the creditor north of Europe and the debtor south of Europe. The turning point, the digital decentralization. The true disruption of the late 20th century was not political, but architectural. The move from analog to digital information flow destroyed the gatekeepers we have discussed since the 17th century. The fact, in the Renaissance, power was owning the press. In the industrial age, it was owning the factory. In the digital age, power is owning the protocol and the algorithm. The mechanic. The internet was designed to survive a nuclear war by having no central hub. This decentralization made it impossible for states to control the narrative. The result, the public sphere of the coffee houses has been replaced by the echo chamber of social media. The expert is no longer the arbiter of truth. Instead, truth is dictated by engagement metrics. This is the reversal of the scientific revolution we explored earlier. We are moving from a world of shared facts back to a world of competing beliefs. Power structures, the rise of the platform state. We are currently witnessing a shift where big tech corporations often possess more structural power than medium-sized nation-states. The shift, these entities control the infrastructure of reality, how we communicate, how we shop, and how we perceive the world. They operate supranationally, much like the Dutch East India Company, but with a level of data-driven surveillance that would have been unimaginable to a 20th century totalitarian. The internal contradiction, the state still has the monopoly on physical force, but the platform has the monopoly on psychological influence. This friction is the defining conflict of our current decade. Human impact, the great fragmentation. For the individual, the result of these shifts is a profound sense of dislocation. Social reality, the stable career and social contract of the 1950s have been replaced by the gig economy and precariousness. The efficiency of the machine has reached such a peak that human labor is increasingly seen as a bottleneck to be automated away by AI. The shift in identity. As the nation-state loses its ability to protect its citizens from global economic shocks, people are retreating into smaller, more radical identities. This is the balkanization of the mind, a return to tribalism fueled by the very technology that was supposed to unite us. The long-term perspective, the recurring loop. As we look back over the 2-hour narrative from 14th century Florence to today, we see a recurring loop. Innovation, the press, the steam engine, the internet, creates a new class of people with power. The old structure, the church, the aristocracy, the nation-state, tries to co-opt or crush the innovation. Conflict ensues as the old rules no longer fit the new reality. A new system is born that is more efficient, but also more complex and fragile. The final assessment. The Renaissance began with the discovery of the individual and the power of observation. We have ended in a world where the individual is a data point and observation is automated. The challenge for the next century is whether we can use our unprecedented machine to solve the biological and social crises we have created, or whether the machine will simply continue to optimize itself at our expense. Since our narrative has now covered the trajectory of Western history from the 14th century to the present, the logical conclusion is to examine the structural legacy we currently inhabit. We are living in the post-Westphalian friction point, a moment where the institutions we built during the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the Industrial Revolution are being tested by the realities of the 21st century. To finish this exploration, let us analyze the three major structural overhangs that define our current reality: debt, demographics, and the digital commons. The structural overhang, debt, and the credit state. We trace the birth of modern finance back to the Dutch Republic. Today, that template has reached its extreme. The mechanic. Most modern states operate on a deficit model. They borrow from the future to pay for the present. This is a direct evolution of the professionalized state that needed to fund the world wars. The strategic reality. Global debt has reached levels that historically resulted in either massive inflation or systemic collapse. The missed alternative of the present day is the inability of governments to restructure these debts without breaking the social contract, the pensions and healthcare that we established after 1945. The fact: money has become entirely decoupled from physical constraints. It is now a digital entry in a ledger, managed by central banks whose experts possess more influence on daily life than elected legislatures. The demographic shift, the end of the industrial population. For the first time since the Black Death, which we discussed at the start of our journey, the human engine is slowing down. The Industrial Revolution was fueled by a population explosion. Today, almost every developed nation, and many developing ones, is seeing a birth rate below replacement level. The internal contradiction. Our economic systems, social security, pensions, and growth, are built on the assumption of a pyramid, many young workers supporting a few elderly. That pyramid is now inverting. The human impact. This leads to a crisis of the welfare state. To survive, states must either automate labor entirely, the AI transition, or rely on mass migration, which triggers the identity versus reason conflicts we saw in the early 20th century. The digital commons, the new geopolitics. In the Renaissance, the commons was the physical land. Today, the commons is the digital infrastructure of the internet. The power structure. We are seeing the rise of digital sovereignty. Just as the Peace of Westphalia defined physical borders, states are now trying to draw borders in the digital cloud. The conflict. On one side is the open stack, the original liberal democratic vision of the internet. On the other is the closed stack, the state-controlled internet, most notably in China. The result: we are moving towards a splinternet, where your reality, your laws, and your access to information are determined by which digital infrastructure you reside in. Final reflection: the human in the machine. We began 2 hours ago in the workshop of Leonardo da Vinci, a man who believed that the human eye could perceive the universal laws of nature. We end in a world where those laws are being recalculated by algorithms that no single human fully understands. The Renaissance gave us humanism, the idea that the human individual is the measure of all things. The Industrial Revolution gave us materialism, the idea that growth and output are the measures of all things. Today, we are in a period of post-humanism, where the machine, economic, digital, and bureaucratic, has become the primary actor. The correct path forward, as we have seen through history, is rarely found in emotional hype or utopian slogans. It is found in the cold, measured analysis of our systems. History does not repeat, but it does rhyme. The tension between the individual and the institution remains the central drama of our species.
Since we have reached the conclusion of the chronological narrative, we will now synthesize the structural patterns that have emerged over these 6 centuries. To understand the Renaissance and its aftermath is to understand the mechanics of how human systems stabilize, fracture, and reinvent themselves. We will conclude with an analysis of the 3 great decouplings that define the modern state: the decoupling of money from value, power from territory, and truth from authority. 1. The decoupling of money from value. In the early Renaissance, a gold florin was worth exactly the amount of gold it contained. By the time we reached the Dutch Golden Age, money began to represent a promise, credit. The final evolution. In 1971, the world moved entirely to fiat currency, money backed not by gold, but by the full faith and credit of the issuing government.
The structural reality, this allowed the state to fund the massive infrastructure of the 20th century, but it also created a system of permanent inflation. The consequence, today, wealth is increasingly abstract. The machine of global finance operates at speeds where human decision-making is a lag. This has led to the rise of cryptocurrencies and decentralized finance, a direct attempt to return to a hard system that bypasses the state, much like the early merchant bankers bypassed the feudal lords. 2. The decoupling of power from territory. From the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 until the end of the Cold War, power was a map. To have power, you had to control land, resources, and people within a physical border. The shift, in the 21st century, the most powerful entities are often borderless platforms. A software update can change the economic reality of a nation more quickly than a military invasion. The internal contradiction. Governments are still organized by territory, nations, but the problems they face, climate change, cyber warfare, pandemics, are global and non-territorial. This creates institutional friction. Rulers are trying to solve 21st century problems using 19th century tools, the nation-state. This mismatch is the primary source of political instability in the modern world. 3. The decoupling of truth from authority. In the Renaissance, the church held the monopoly on truth. The scientific revolution broke that monopoly, placing it in the hands of reason and evidence. The current crisis, we are entering a post-verification era. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the state managed truth through centralized education and media. Today, the sheer volume of information has rendered centralization impossible. The mechanic, algorithms prioritize engagement over accuracy. Because outrage generates more engagement than measured analysis, the digital environment naturally selects for polarization. The human impact, this is the dismantling of the public sphere. Without a shared set of facts, the social contract becomes impossible to maintain, since different groups within the same nation literally inhabit different realities. Final summary. The cost of complexity. The narrative we have traced, from the first brushstrokes of the Mona Lisa to the firing of a rocket, is a story of increasing complexity. Every solution we have explored, the printing press, the steam engine, the central bank, the European Union, was designed to solve a specific problem. However, each solution created a more complex system, which in turn created even larger, more complex problems. This is the entropy of progress. We have built a world that is incredibly efficient and productive, but also highly sensitive to disruption. The soothing nature of this narrative lies in the realization that we have been here before. Every era feels like a crisis of the system until a new structure is built to manage the chaos. To finalize this 2-hour exploration, we must address the structural limit we are currently approaching. If the Renaissance was the birth of the individual, and the industrial era was the birth of the system, our current era is the collision of the system with the individual. We will conclude by examining how the legacy of Renaissance humanism is being reconciled with the algorithmic state and the long-term consequences for the European project. The structural limit, the automation of decision-making. Throughout this narrative, we have seen power shift from kings to bureaucrats, and then to experts. We are now seeing the final shift, from experts to algorithms. The mechanic. During the scientific revolution, we used mathematics to describe the world. Today, we use mathematics, AI, to predict and govern the world. The problem of the black box. Unlike the laws of physics discovered by Newton or the anatomical charts of Vesalius, modern AI systems often reach conclusions through processes that are not transparent to human reason. The consequence, this is a fundamental challenge to the Enlightenment ideal of reason. If we cannot explain why a system makes a decision regarding credit, law, or resource allocation, we have returned to a form of divine right, where the oracle, the code, must be obeyed because it is perceived as superior to human judgment. The social legacy, the crisis of the liberal subject. The Renaissance taught us that the individual is a unique, coherent agent. The modern digital structure, however, treats the individual as a bundle of data points to be optimized for consumption or stability. Internal contradiction. We have more freedom in terms of information access than any generation in history, yet we have less agency because our choices are increasingly pre-filtered by recommendation engines. The impact on democracy. As we saw in the French Revolution, democracy requires a public capable of deliberation. But if the public is fragmented into personalized data silos, the general will, as Rousseau called it, becomes impossible to calculate. This is not a failure of character, but a failure of information architecture. The European perspective, the laboratory of the future. Europe today is the primary site of a major missed alternative or strategic choice. The decision. While the US and China have leaned into the platform state, one driven by markets, the other by the state, Europe has attempted to become the regulatory state. The strategy. Through frameworks like the GDPR and AI Acts, the European Union is attempting to reimpose Renaissance-era humanism on 21st century technology. They are trying to prove that the machine can be governed by law. The risk. This strategy is a slower rate of innovation. Europe is choosing stability and rights over speed and power. Whether this choice will allow Europe to remain a global actor or turn it into a museum of the 20th century is the defining question of the next 50 years. Closing reflection. The horizon of the Renaissance. As the narrative ends, we return to the hills of Tuscany. The men and women of the 14th century did not know they were in a renaissance. They only knew they were living through a time where the old ways of explaining the world, the medieval church and the feudal lord, no longer worked. We are in a similar in-between time. The Renaissance gave us the tools of observation. The Enlightenment gave us the tools of reason. The Industrial Age gave us the tools of power. Our task is not to revert to a simpler time, but to apply the intellectual honesty we have traced through these 2 hours to our own systems. History suggests that the structures we build will eventually fail, but the human capacity to observe that failure and iterate upon it is the one constant that has remained since Petrarch first picked up a recovered manuscript and began to read.
Since we have completed the chronological and structural arc of Western development, we will now conclude this session by analyzing the metabolics of the modern state. To understand the Renaissance to the present is to understand how human societies have managed the flow of 3 critical fuels: energy, information, and trust. When these 3 flows are in balance, civilizations expand. When they decouple, systems collapse. 1. The energy metabolic, from muscle to atom. We began with a world powered by the sun, agriculture, and human labor. The Renaissance was the peak of organic energy. The transition, the Industrial Revolution, was a shift from flow energy, wind or water, to stock energy, coal or oil. This allowed for the exponential growth of the state and the population. The modern crisis. We are now attempting a second great transition, moving back to flow, renewables, or toward nuclear to avoid the environmental exhaustion of the stock model. The structural consequence. This is not just a technical change, it is a geopolitical one. The old power was built on controlling the geography of oil. The new power is built on controlling the chemistry of batteries and the physics of semiconductors. 2. The information metabolic, from scarcity to gluttony. In the 14th century, information was a luxury good. A book was a treasure. The Renaissance was the first time information became a commodity via the press. The peak, in the 20th century, information was a utility, managed by centralized broadcasters and the state. The modern crisis. Today, information is noise. We have moved from a lack of data to a lack of attention. The result? This is the entropy of truth. When information is infinite and free, its value drops to 0,
and the trust required to run a complex society begins to evaporate. The third trust metabolic, the invisible infrastructure. This is the most fragile part of the legacy we have traced. Trust is the social glue that allows the machine to function. The Renaissance model was trust was personal and local, the merchant's word, the guild's seal. The modern model, trust became institutional and abstract, the central bank, the rule of law, the scientific peer review. The current fragility. As we have seen, the democratic deficit and the rise of the algorithmic state have eroded trust in institutions. Without institutional trust, the Dutch-English financial template collapses, and the Westphalian peace dissolves into internal tribalism. The narrative conclusion. The stewardship of the machine. We have spent 2 hours looking at how we built the machine of the modern world. We have seen that it was not built by heroes or villains, but by individuals making choices within the context of their time, trying to solve debts, win wars, or understand the stars. The Renaissance ended because it succeeded. It created a world so complex that humanism alone could no longer govern it. The Enlightenment ended because its reason was co-opted by industrial warfare. Our own era is currently in the process of ending as we realize that our digital and financial machines are outrunning our biological and social capacity to manage them. The final lesson of this narrative is that context is the only antidote to chaos. By understanding how these structures were built, we lose the fear that they are natural or eternal. They are human inventions. And if they no longer serve the human at the center of the Renaissance vision, they can and will be redesigned.
To move deeper into the cultural and artistic dimensions of the Renaissance, we must examine the structural synthesis of the 15th and 16th centuries. The art of this period was not merely decoration. It was a sophisticated information technology used to communicate the new relationship between man, nature, and the state. The artist-scientist, the integration of observation. In the medieval world, art was symbolic. A tree was not a specific oak, but an icon of treeness. The Renaissance shifted this to empirical representation. This shift was driven by the same logic that fueled the scientific revolution, the belief that truth is found through the physical senses. Leonardo da Vinci and the mechanics of life. Leonardo did not view his paintings and his anatomical dissections as separate hobbies. For him, they were a single project of mapping the world. To paint the Mona Lisa, he dissected the human face to understand which muscles controlled the corners of the lips. The decision. Leonardo's decision to study hydrodynamics, the flow of water, influenced how he painted the movement of hair and the atmosphere of his landscapes, sfumato. The impact, this effectively turned the canvas into a scientific laboratory. Art became a tool for discovering optical laws, such as how light refracts through the eye. Michelangelo and the architecture of power. While Leonardo was the observer, Michelangelo was the structural engineer of the human form. His work on the Sistine Chapel was a philosophical statement in stone and paint. The inspiration, Michelangelo was deeply influenced by Neoplatonism, a philosophy that argued the human body was a reflection of divine geometry. The technique, he used cangiante, changing colors, and hypermusculature to convey a sense of terribilità, emotional intensity. This wasn't just aesthetic, it was designed to overwhelm the viewer, reinforcing the authority of the papacy through visual awe. The literary and philosophical pivot, humanism in print. The Renaissance man was a product of a specific educational curriculum, the Studia Humanitatis. This was a move away from logic-based scholasticism toward rhetoric, history, and poetry. Petrarch and the search for the self. Petrarch's Ascent of Mount Ventoux is often cited as the birth of modern individualism. He climbed the mountain not for a military or religious reason, but simply to see the view, and then wrote about his internal emotional state. This was a radical departure from the medieval focus on the collective. The role of the printing press.
As we discussed, the press turned these private thoughts into public debate. Erasmus de Rotterdam used the press to criticize the corruption of the state and church with biting satire, the praise of folly. The consequence, literacy became a prerequisite for power. The courtier had to be as skilled with a sonnet as he was with a sword. This professionalization of the elite created the first modern bureaucratic class. Transition from culture to the modern state. These cultural and scientific advancements did not exist in a vacuum. They provided the operating system for the modern state. 1. The geometry of the state. Cartography. The same mathematical perspective used by Raphael in the School of Athens was applied to the mapping of territory. The fact, for the first time, rulers had accurate maps of their domains. They could see their land as a grid to be taxed and managed. The impact, this transformed the state from a vague collection of feudal loyalties into a defined territorial entity. The map became the blueprint for the modern border. 2. The professionalization of diplomacy. The Renaissance city-states invented the resident ambassador. Because the world was now seen through the lens of realpolitico, thanks to thinkers like Machiavelli, states realized they needed a constant flow of information. The decision, diplomacy moved from honor-based interactions to information-based strategy. Ambassadors became the first intelligence officers, using the same analytical skills taught by humanist tutors to predict the moves of rival princes. 3. The secularization of authority. The scientific revolution's focus on natural law eventually led to the idea of natural rights. If the universe ran on laws that even God didn't interfere with, then perhaps the state should also run on laws that the king couldn't interfere with. The result, this laid the groundwork for the rule of law. The transition from the king's will to the state's law is the most significant legacy of the late Renaissance. The final reflection. The interconnectedness of the machine. We see that the Mona Lisa and the microscope are cousins. Both are born from a society that decided to stop looking at the heavens for answers and start looking at the world in front of them. This shift created a surge in productivity and power that allowed Europe to dominate the globe for 4 centuries, but it also created the machine that eventually grew beyond human control. The Renaissance didn't just give us beautiful statues, it gave us the scientific method and the administrative bureaucracy. It taught us that the world is a puzzle to be solved, a belief that continues to drive every technological and social transformation we face today. As the light of the High Renaissance reached its zenith, the individual stood at the center of a newly ordered universe. But this newfound focus on the human capacity for reason and observation soon acted as a double-edged sword. The same critical lens that Leonardo used to dissect the human body was turned toward the most powerful institution in the world, the Roman Catholic Church. The religious fracture, the Reformation as a structural crisis. The Reformation was not merely a theological debate, it was a systemic shock that shattered the universal Christendom of the Middle Ages. In 1517, Martin Luther, an Augustinian monk, pinned his 95 Theses to the door of Wittenberg Castle Church. The individual versus the institution. Luther's core doctrine, sola fide, faith alone, was the ultimate application of Renaissance individualism to religion. He argued that the individual did not need the machine of the church, its priests, sacraments, or indulgences, to reach God. The priesthood of all believers meant that every person was their own spiritual authority. The information weapon. This movement would have remained a local dispute if not for the printing press. Luther was the world's first media star. Between 1517 and 1520, his work sold over 300,000 copies. The state could no longer burn a single man to stop an idea. The idea was now replicated in thousands of homes. The political consequence. Rulers like Frederick the Wise of Saxony and later Henry VIII of England saw an opportunity. By backing the reformers, they could seize church lands and, more importantly, stop the flow of tax money to Rome. This was the birth of the national church, where the king replaced the pope as the head of the local social order. The economic shock, the New World and the price revolution. As Europe tore itself apart over the Word of God, it was simultaneously being flooded by the wealth of a new world. The voyage of Christopher Columbus in 1492, followed by the conquests of Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro, introduced a tectonic shift in the European economy. The Silver Deluge. The discovery of the Potosi silver mines in modern-day Bolivia created an unprecedented influx of bullion into Spain. Under Charles V and Philip II, Spain became a global superpower, but it was a power built on a fragile foundation. The price revolution. The sudden surplus of silver did not make everyone rich. Instead, it caused massive inflation. Across Europe, the price of basic goods like bread and grain quadrupled in the 16th century. The social impact. For the traditional nobility, whose wealth was tied to fixed land rents, this was a disaster. However, for the rising merchant class who traded in commodities, it was a golden age. This accelerated the shift of power from the blood, the aristocracy, to the gold, the bourgeoisie. The shift in global gravity. The economic center of the world moved from the Mediterranean, Italy, to the Atlantic, Spain, then the Netherlands and England. The great Renaissance banks of Florence were replaced by the global trading companies of the North. The synthesis, the birth of the competitive state. These two forces, the religious fracture and the economic shock, forced the modern state into its final form. Rulers realized that survival required more than just a crown. It required efficiency and bureaucracy. The fiscal military state. To fight the religious wars, like the 30 Years' War, states had to develop sophisticated systems of taxation and debt. They had to count their citizens, map their resources, and build professional standing armies. The colonial machine. The wealth of the Americas led to the creation of joint stock companies. This combined the Renaissance's legal innovations with the New World's resources, allowing private investors to fund the expansion of the state's empire. The human cost. This era of progress was mirrored by the start of the transatlantic slave trade. The individualism of the European Renaissance was tragically not extended to the populations of the Americas or Africa. The same ships that carried the new science also carried the chains of industrialized human exploitation. As the 16th century closed, the world was no longer the quiet, ordered place it had been for 1,000 years. It was loud, fractured, and moving at a speed that the human mind was struggling to track. The Renaissance had given humanity the tools to observe the world, but the Reformation and the New World had given them a world that was almost too large to observe.
As the dust settled on the 16th century, Europe found itself in a state of cognitive dissonance. The religious fractures of the Reformation had proved that the truth of the Church was no longer a single unified pillar. Simultaneously, the economic shocks of the New World had shown that the physical map of the universe was far larger than the ancient Greeks or Romans had ever imagined. This period of instability served as the catalyst for the scientific revolution. If the Word of God was being debated by theologians and the wealth of the world was causing economic chaos, where could a person find certainty? The answer for a new generation of thinkers lay in the language of mathematics. The architect of the heavens, the Copernican pivot. The first major crack in the old reality occurred in 1543 with the publication of Nicolaus Copernicus's De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestiales. For 2,000 years, the geocentric model, the idea that the Earth sat motionless at the center of the universe, had been the bedrock of both science and theology. It mirrored the social order, fixed, hierarchical, and divinely ordained. The decision. Copernicus, a Polish canon, realized that the math simply didn't work.
The planets didn't move in the perfect circles the ancients predicted. By placing the sun at the center, heliocentrism, the math became simpler, more elegant. The consequence. This was not just a change in astronomy, it was a psychological displacement. If the Earth was just another wandering star, then humanity was no longer the physical center of God's creation. This created a profound sense of vertigo that would haunt the 17th century. Galileo and the death of authority. If Copernicus provided the theory, Galileo Galilei provided the evidence. In 1609, Galileo turned a newly invented Dutch spyglass, the telescope, toward the moon. The observation. He didn't see a perfect celestial sphere as the church taught. He saw craters, mountains, and valleys. He saw moons orbiting Jupiter, proving that not everything revolved around the Earth. The clash of jurisdictions. Galileo's conflict with the Inquisition in 1633 was the defining moment of the era. It was a battle over who has the right to define reality. The church argued that truth was revealed through Scripture. Galileo argued that truth was discovered through the two books of God, the Bible and the Book of Nature, the latter of which was written in mathematical characters. The result. Though Galileo was silenced, the method was born. Proof was no longer about who was the most powerful person in the room, it was about what could be measured, timed, and replicated. Newton and the clockwork universe. The climax of this era arrived with Isaac Newton. In his 1687 work, Principia Mathematica, Newton synthesized the work of his predecessors into a single universal system, the universal law. Newton proved that the same force that pulled an apple to the ground, gravity, also kept the moon in its orbit. The universe was not a series of magical separate realms, it was a single coherent machine. The structural shift. This gave birth to determinism. If the universe was a clockwork mechanism governed by laws, then those laws could be understood and utilized. This shifted the human role from passive observer to active engineer. The societal foundation. Science and the modern world did not just change how we saw the stars, it changed how we ran our societies. The transition into the age of reason provided the structural blueprints for the modern world. The rise of the expert. Rulers began to realize that power came from technological superiority. To win wars, they needed better ballistics, math. To colonize, they needed better navigation, astronomy. To grow the economy, they needed better metallurgy, chemistry. The secularization of politics. As the universe became mechanical, the state followed. Thinkers like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke began to treat politics as a science. They looked for natural laws of government, leading to the idea of the social contract, the belief that the state exists to serve a function, not to fulfill a divine mystery. The industrial seed. By proving that nature could be mastered, the scientific revolution set the stage for the industrial revolution. Once you understand the physics of steam and the mechanics of gears, the move from the workshop to the factory becomes inevitable. As we look at the legacy of this era, we see the birth of the modern mindset, the belief that through observation, measurement, and reason, any problem can be solved. The Renaissance gave us the individual, but the scientific revolution gave that individual the tools to rebuild the world.
The transition from a mechanical universe to a mechanical society was not a sudden leap, but a calculated expansion. As the 17th century closed, the intellectual tools forged by Galileo and Newton were taken out of the laboratory and into the halls of government. This was the dawn of the Enlightenment, a period where reason became the primary metric for human progress, leading to a radical restructuring of the social order. The science of society, the Enlightenment's blueprint. If the universe was a clock, then society was a machine that had been poorly maintained. Enlightenment thinkers, or philosophers, argued that the traditional ways of doing things, absolute monarchy, religious dogmatism, and feudal privilege, were simply irrational. The social contract.
Following the logic of the scientific revolution, John Locke argued that humans possessed natural rights, life, liberty, and property that were as fundamental as the laws of gravity. He proposed that government was a contract. We give up some freedom in exchange for the protection of our rights. The division of knowledge. In France, Denis Diderot and Jean Le Rond d'Alembert began the monumental task of the encyclopedia. This wasn't just a book, it was a map of human knowledge intended to bypass the church's censorship. By categorizing everything from the art of pin-making to political authority, they aimed to change the way people thought by giving them the facts to think for themselves. The turning point, the great political explosions. The structural tension between the new reason and the old order eventually reached the breaking point. The Enlightenment provided the intellectual ammunition for two of the most significant shifts in modern history. The American Experiment, 1776. This was the first practical application of Enlightenment theory on a national scale. The Declaration of Independence was essentially a Newton-style proof applied to politics. Given these self-evident truths, therefore, the colonies have a right to be free. It replaced subjects with citizens. The French Revolution, 1879. This was the more radical and far more violent version of the same impulse. In France, the goal was not just to separate from a king, but to dismantle the entire feudal structure. The Decision. The National Assembly's Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen was the ultimate Renaissance document. It declared that sovereignty resided in the nation, not the king. The Consequence. The attempt to run a society by pure reason led to a total collapse of traditional authority. When the machine of the state was stripped of its religious and monarchical oil, the friction turned into the reign of terror. It proved that while reason can build a machine, it struggles to manage the chaotic emotions of a desperate population. The Industrial Spark. When science met capital. As the political revolutions were tearing down the old social hierarchies, a quieter but more powerful revolution was beginning in the coal mines and textile mills of Great Britain. The Industrial Revolution was the final, tangible result of the Renaissance scientific lineage. The Watt steam engine, 1776, was the moment the mechanical universe became a mechanical workforce. By applying the physics of pressure and vacuum, James Watt created a machine that could do the work of 100 horses. The Urban Shock. For the first time in human history, the majority of people moved from the fields to the cities. This created a new social class, the proletariat. The Fact. The Renaissance individual was a craftsman. The industrial individual was an operator. This changed the psychology of the human being from one of creation to one of production. The Synthesis. The modern world order. By the mid-19th century, the cultural, scientific, and political developments of the Renaissance had fused into the world we recognize today. The nation-state. Borders were no longer defined by a king's marriage, but by a shared language and a centralized bureaucracy. The secular public square. While religion remained, it was no longer the primary source of legal or scientific authority. Evidence and law became the universal languages of power. The global market. The economic shocks of the New World had evolved into a global capitalist system driven by industrial output and protected by the military technological superiority of the professionalized state.
The long-term legacy of the Renaissance and its subsequent revolutions is the world we inhabit today, a reality of hyperconnectivity, where the individual is no longer just a physical entity, but a digital one. To understand our current moment, we must see it as the final, logical extension of the Renaissance's thirst for observation and the Enlightenment's hunger for rationalization. The final synthesis, from the human to the digital machine. In the 21st century, the Renaissance individual, the master of his own destiny, has been integrated into a global, algorithmic structure. The transition from the mechanical world to the informational world represents the third great shift in human history. The individual as data.
In the 15th century, Leonardo mapped the human muscle to understand movement. Today, algorithms map human behavior to predict intent. Our clicks, locations, and preferences are the new anatomical charts. This has created a paradoxical state. We have the extreme individualism born of the Renaissance, yet we are more predictable and managed than ever before. The fragmentation of the public square. The Enlightenment promised a world of shared reason. However, the digital revolution has shattered that square into millions of personalized echo chambers. In the Renaissance, the printing press democratized information. Today, the internet has deinstitutionalized it. This has brought back a 16th century level of religious and ideological tribalism, where truth is once again a matter of which tribe you belong to. The structural legacy, the modern state's paradox. The modern state, built on the foundations of the scientific and industrial revolutions, is currently facing its greatest challenge: sovereignty versus technology. The Westphalian state was built to control territory, but today's most powerful forces, climate change, global capital, and artificial intelligence, do not respect borders. We're seeing a friction between 19th century political structures and 21st century technological realities. The return of the expert. Just as in the 17th century, power moved from the priest to the scientist, we are now seeing power move from the politician to the technocrat and the coder. Decisions that affect millions are often made within black box algorithms that are as opaque to the average person as a Latin mass was to a medieval peasant. The human impact. The Renaissance spirit in the 21st century. Despite these systemic pressures, the core achievement of the Renaissance, the belief in human potential, remains the primary driver of our era. The democratization of creation. In the Renaissance, only a handful of masters could create and distribute work. Today, the tools of art, science, and communication are in the hands of billions. We are living through a mass renaissance, where the barrier to entry for the Studia Humanitatis has essentially vanished. The quest for the horizon. The same spirit that drove Columbus to the Atlantic and Galileo to the stars now drives us toward the edges of the solar system and the depths of our own DNA. We are still Renaissance people, defined by an insatiable curiosity and a refusal to accept the world as it is given to us. Final reflection. The cycle of rebirth. The story of the Renaissance is not a story of a single moment in Italy. It is a story of the human decision to prioritize observation over dogma and reason over tradition. This narrative has taken us through the workshops of Florence, the laboratories of the 17th century, the factories of the 18th, and the digital grids of today. We have seen that every birth, rinascita, brings with it a fracture. The light of knowledge always casts a shadow of new, more complex problems. Our current task is to ensure that as our machines become more intelligent, our societies remain human, retaining that Renaissance spark of empathy, creativity, and individual dignity. As we wrap up this exploration of the Renaissance, we invite you to become a part of our community, where history meets insightful analysis. Our channel is a space for those who seek deeper understanding and thoughtful content, delivered with care and dedication. Stay with us as we continue to uncover more fascinating stories and insights and become a part of our growing journey.
If you stayed until the end, you're not here for entertainment. You're here to understand how the past quietly shaped the world you live in. This channel is a growing library of long, calm, and serious history. No noise, no rushing, just deep stories meant to be listened to slowly. If this way of telling history matters to you, there are more stories waiting on this channel.